Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade American history class. Today we're going to be looking at the Bill of Rights, your shield and protection against the abuses of the majority. The amendments today we're going to be looking at are Amendments 5, 6, and 7. Textbook readings for today comes from Chapter 6, Section 2, pages 216 to 221. Our guiding questions today are, what are your rights under the Fifth Amendment? What are your rights under the Sixth Amendment? What are your Miranda rights? Why do you have a right to a lawyer or an attorney? And what are your rights under the Seventh Amendment? So let's get started here and look here at our Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment is a really long one. I'm not going to read the entire amendment in this case because it's really, really long. But I am going to break down the amendment into its 5 important components. So here are your 5 big components of the Fifth Amendment. The first one of these is that you have to be found guilty by something known as a grand jury before you actually go to trial to determine your innocence or your guilt. A grand jury is like a pre-trial. So let's say, for example, that I robbed a store and they've arrested me and they've collected evidence on my accused crime. Now, before I actually go to trial, there is a pre-trial called a grand jury hearing where the prosecution and the law enforcement presents the evidence and says, here's the evidence that we have against this individual. And the grand jury, which is made up of people in our community, our citizens, neighbor, jury of our peers, they look at the evidence. And if the grand jury feels, yeah, there's something here that this person might have broken the law or done something wrong, and this should probably go to trial. They don't necessarily say they are innocent or guilty. They're just saying, I think there's something here that should go to trial. The grand jury can also go back and tell the government and say, you know what, the evidence you have here is really shaky. I don't think this person did anything wrong. There's not enough evidence to really move this on to the next stage. So we're going to just say we're not going to push this on to the actual trial. Again, it doesn't say you're guilty or innocent. It's just saying there's just not enough evidence to move it on to trial. The second big part of the Fifth Amendment is that you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. This is sometimes known as double jeopardy. So if I go that same example and say I've been arrested of a crime of robbing this store, it goes to the grand jury. The grand jury says, yeah, there's something here. Let's take this to trial. There's a trial. There's a judge. There's an attorney. There's me saying, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. And a jury that listens to the evidence. And the jury comes back and says, there's no way this person did this. They are innocent. They're completely innocent. The government can't keep retrying me for that same crime of robbing that same store. Now, if I go back and rob another store, then I have another trial. But they can't keep repeating that same trial over and over for that same crime. This becomes known as double jeopardy. And this is really a protection so that the government just cannot keep trying you until they get the results they want. You also, under the Fifth Amendment, the third big idea is you have a right not to force to testify against yourself. Sometimes people will say, I plead the Fifth. I'm not going to say anything, because if I do, that could be used against me in a court, and I could be found guilty by using my own voice, my own testimony against myself. And you can't do that. You're protected under the Fifth Amendment from being forced to testify against yourself. The fourth principle of the Fifth Amendment is that a very important idea we have in our legal system is that everybody is presumed innocent until proven guilty. And then the fifth piece, which doesn't seem to match all the other parts, but basically it refers to this idea that government cannot take your property unless it's for a public use and they have to pay and compensate it for you. So as you can see in the Fifth Amendment, there's a lot of parts to this Fifth Amendment. The big ones are this idea of a grand jury. Again, the grand jury is like a pre-trial. It looks at the evidence. If they think there's enough evidence this should go to trial, then the grand jury bumps it up to a trial where a judge, a jury, and will hear the evidence and decide, are you innocent or are you guilty? Other big idea, this idea of I'm innocent until proven guilty. It is the fact of the government, it is the burden of the government that they have to provide evidence beyond a reasonable doubt of this person's guilty of a crime. So we are innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Also, the Fifth Amendment, I take the Fifth. I don't have to testify against myself. And then, of course, you can't be tried for the same crime twice, double jeopardy. And then if any land taken from you for use for public purpose, the government can do this. This is known sometimes as eminent domain. And they can do this as long as you are fairly compensated. So let's talk here a little bit about the Fifth Amendment and somebody named Ernesto Miranda, and a very important name that you may have heard of involving something like your Miranda rights. So let's read the story here. In 1963, Ernesto Miranda is arrested in Phoenix, Arizona at his home. At the police station, an 18-year-old girl identified the 23-year-old truck driver, Ernesto, as the man who had kidnapped and raped her. Miranda confessed after 2 hours of questioning by law enforcement. His confession was used against him at his trial. He was found guilty and sentenced to 2 20 to 30-year terms of imprisonment. Miranda's lawyers, however, appealed the verdict on the grounds that Miranda had been pressured by law enforcement to incriminate himself, to testify against himself. He had not been told that according to the Bill of Rights, he had the right to remain silent, or that anything he said could be used against him in the court, or that he had the right to have a lawyer present. Without knowing these things, he had been forced to act as a witness against himself. Therefore, Miranda's confession could not be used as evidence. The Supreme Court eventually agreed and reversed his conviction. Ernesto Miranda got to start over and have a new trial. Using evidence other than his conviction and his confession, he was convicted and sent to prison again. After being paroled, he worked as a delivery man until in 1976 he was at age 34. He was stabbed to death in a bar fight. The suspect in his murder was read his Miranda rights at the time of arrest. So today, if you are arrested for a crime, law enforcement will read to you your Miranda rights. Why do they read you your Miranda rights? Because of Miranda versus Arizona that was held in front of the Supreme Court. What are your Miranda rights? Well, you have a right to remain silent. That's specified in the Fifth Amendment. Anything you can and anything you say can and be held against you in the court of law. Again, that's in the Fifth Amendment. The Miranda rights also go into aspects that are in the next amendment we're going to be talking about, the Sixth Amendment, that you have a right to a lawyer and to have that lawyer present before and during questioning by law enforcement. If you cannot afford to hire a lawyer, one will be appointed to represent you before and during questioning if you wish one. Do you understand each of these rights I have explained to you? Having these rights in mind, now do you wish to talk to law enforcement? These are your Miranda rights. So let's talk here about the Sixth Amendment. Again, this is a very long one, so I'm not going to read the entire Sixth Amendment, but basically the Sixth Amendment deals with your rights under criminal investigation. So if you break the law, you have committed a crime, what are your protections? Well, under the Sixth Amendment, you have a right to a speedy and public trial and a right to be represented by a lawyer. So when we think about the Sixth Amendment, all people arrested of a crime who have under the Fifth Amendment presumption of innocence will go in front of a jury after the grand jury has heard the evidence and says, yeah, I think there's something here. So it goes now to the actual jury of your peers. And every American has a right to a public trial that's speedy, meaning that it needs to happen within a relatively short amount of time. You can't languish in jail forever until your trial. It has to be a speedy and public trial that's in the view of the public. And a jury of public members, people in your community, has to decide your innocence or your guilt. Also, the Sixth Amendment says you have a right to have a lawyer. If you can't afford a lawyer, then the court will be able to provide you one to help protect you and your rights through this process, this criminal case process. Also, in the Sixth Amendment right, you have a right to hear and question all witnesses against you. So anyone who says, I saw you, you broke that crime, you have a right to ask those witnesses questions. And you also have a right to know why you've been arrested. The government can't just arrest you and throw you in jail. And when you say, hey, what did I do? I didn't do anything wrong. They have a right to say, this is exactly what crime you broke. You have the right to know this. Why is the Sixth Amendment so vitally important? Well, let me tell you the story about Powell versus Alabama. This is sometimes known as the Lawyerless Nine. Two of the first famous Sixth Amendment cases involving the same 9 poor African Americans, ranging in age from 12 to 20, took place in 1931. In 1931, these 9 African Americans were pulled off of a train near Scottsboro, Alabama, and accused of raping 2 white girls on the train. The defendants couldn't afford to pay a lawyer, and none of the lawyers in Scottsboro would agree to represent them for free. All were found guilty and sentenced to death. Newspapers around the country began referring to the trial as a legal lynching, or a state-sanctioned attempt at hanging by an unruly mob. When the case known as Powell versus Alabama reached the Supreme Court in 1932, the Supreme Court ruled in the defendant's favor. The state had violated their right to counsel under the Sixth Amendment. The defendants, however, were not set free. They were tried twice more, and in 1935 their case came before the Supreme Court, again in Norris versus Alabama. The Supreme Court ruled that their Sixth Amendment rights had also been violated, but this time in a different way. You see, in the trial, they had an all-white jury, and in Alabama in the 1930s, that was a pretty common practice. African Americans were never called for jury duty. Despite the victory, the last of the defendants, however, were not released until 1950. So according to the Sixth Amendment, you have a right to a lawyer, and if you cannot be provided one, if you cannot afford one, then the court will provide you a public defender that will defend you. Also, you have a right to a speedy public trial of a jury of your peers hearing your evidence in your case. So that's the Sixth Amendment. You have a right to a lawyer. If you can't afford one, the court will provide you one for you. The final amendment we're going to be looking at today is the Seventh Amendment, and this one, again, is a very long one, so I'm not going to read all of it to you here, but basically involves civil cases. A civil case is a case involving generally destruction of property or a disagreement among two or more citizens. So the Seventh Amendment basically says that you have a right under the Seventh Amendment to have a jury hear the evidence, that a judge cannot rule on civil matters, and that everybody has a right to a trial in all civil cases. Typically, civil cases deal with things like property damage, disputes between people with contracts, divorce, child custody. Those all deal with the Seventh Amendment. So thanks for listening to our look at the Bill of Rights, Amendments number 5, 6, and 7. Thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions, please make sure you come talk to your teacher.